In the last section, we started adding some code to test to make sure that we have a validation around a user's name. I specifically added a test named requires a user name here. And so just to be clear, we're going to add on two different validation rules. First, we're going to validate that a username was provided. And then second off, we're going to validate that the username that was provided is longer than 2 characters. So two separate rules, and so we're going to write two separate tests. We're going to first start off with the requires username, and then we will fill in the second test to make sure that the username is at least 2 characters long in the next section, or as the next test, excuse me. Okay, so let's get started with this. This first rule that we're adding to just require a property is definitely the easiest way or the easiest level of validation we can do. All it does is it says if we are going to save this record, a given property must not be undefined. So to specify this validation, we will add a new rule inside of our schema, inside of our user.js file. So I'm in the source directory in my user.js file, and I'm going to find my schema right here. So since we are adding a validation around a very particular property, we're going to add some more configuration in place of this type string right here. So instead of just saying a name should be a string, we're going to replace that with a full object. And then inside this object, we are going to add a bunch of different properties to describe not only the type of name, because we still have to specify the type, but we're also going to specify some of the validation options that we want to apply to the name property as well. So first, I'm going to add in a type of string. So notice that although I deleted the kind of annotation of the type, to say that name was a type and replaced it with the object, I'm still going to specify what type of property the name is going to be. So it's going to be a string, so I'm going to say type of string. Next, to make sure that Mongoose understands that the name is always going to be required, I'm going to pass in a required flag, and this is going to point at an array of true. And then the second element in here is going to be the message that we want to display whenever a name is not provided. So inside of here, it always makes sense to provide a very plain English error message, something that can eventually be shown to our user. So I'm going to say simply name is required. One of the biggest headaches around validation, and this is something that is common to just every web framework that I've ever worked with, is making sure that your validation errors can be shown as user-friendly messages. Okay, and what I mean by that is showing a user something like name is required on a form is 100% acceptable. It's totally reasonable, right? A user doesn't enter a name, yeah, you can say to them name is required. Saying something to a user like user schema expected name prop or something like that, that is not a reasonable error message to show to a user. So you always want to make sure wherever possible, give your user some plain English thing that they can see. That really makes your job on the front end a lot easier, because on the front end, you won't have to look at this message right here and somehow translate it over to some English-friendly equivalent. So we're just going to go simply with name is required, like so. Okay, so as far as making sure that a property is required, this is all we got to do. So you'll notice that this is doing absolutely no validation around the length of a name that is provided. So we will come back later and add in that extra validation, but just making sure that something's required, this is it. So now that we've got this rule inside of here, we can flip over to our validation test file and add a test in here and make sure that the error message is going to show up as we expect. So inside of our it block, we are first going to create a new user, and we're going to specifically make sure that we are not giving it a name. We'll then validate the user that's created, and then we will make an assertion about the error message. So at the end of the day, I want to have something that says like assert error message is equal to name is required, or something similar to that. So we'll start off by making a new user. So I'm just going to give them, since they don't really have a name at all, we're saying specifically they're not giving a name, I'm going to assign them to a variable of lowercase u user. And we'll say this is going to be user. And then I will give them a name of undefined. And so the reason I'm doing this right here is to just be 100% explicit for the purpose of my tests. I could have just as easily left this entirely blank and just passed an empty object and would have the exact same effect. but I'm going to specifically pass in a name of undefined so that any other engineer who comes along in the future can see this and they can say, okay, clearly like they want name to be undefined here. The test must be doing something around the name of the user. So now that we've created the user, you'll notice that I'm not going to actually attempt to save it. I want to just specifically validate this model and then look at what is produced by that validation process. So I'm not going to save the model. Instead, I'm going to call a function on this thing, user.validateSync. Okay. This function will return an object that I'm going to refer to as the validation result. This validation result object right here is going to have all the results of validating the user model. So if we had a ton of properties wrong, like if this user is just absolute trash, there'll be a lot of different properties on the validation result that we can look at. The other thing I want to point your attention to is the validateSync function. It's kind of a funny name, isn't it? Like validateSync. This is to differentiate itself from a very similar but slightly different function called validate. The difference between validate and validateSync is that validateSync is a synchronous validation process. So we can call validateSync, and in the exact same breath, in the exact same line, we'll get a result back about the validation. If we call just validate, this does not return a validation result. Instead, we can pass a callback function that will be called with our validation result. And then inside of this function, we can do something with that validation result. The reason that we would have validate with a callback function right here is to run any type of asynchronous validation that we might want to have. So perhaps whenever a user runs validation, maybe we need to reach out to our database or reach out to some web service or something like that and say, hey, is there already a user with like a name that has the same last name as this one? We can handle stuff like uniqueness at the database level. We would use, so if we want to make sure that every user has a unique name, we can handle that in a different fashion. But if we want to have some really fancy validation, like see if this person has the same last name as anyone else who's ever been saved or something like that, that's where we would start to use the asynchronous method of validation where we use a callback function. So because we're not doing anything like that, because we're just looking at the properties as they're given to us and then making a decision, are they valid or not instantly, we can use the validateSync, there we go, function. So we call validateSync, we instantly get back a result. That's all. Okay, so now that we've got the validation result, I think that we're at a pretty good point in time where we could console log out this validation result and just see what it looks like. What properties does it have? What do we have access to? So I'm going to add in a console log of validation result. Let's save this and flip over to our terminal just see what we get. So you'll see that when we get this validation result, we get what almost looks like an error message. It gives us an entire stack trace right here. So when a validation errors out, it actually produces an error object. And you'll see specifically it says right here, mongoose error. So this is not a normal object, it is an error object. And whenever JavaScript produces an error object, it's going to give us a stack trace as well. Looking at the error object itself, you can see that it's got a couple of interesting properties. So I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top of this thing. Okay, so here we go. Here's the very top. So the very top level thing, it's got an error. And if we scroll back down, it has this errors property, which is what we really care about. We care about this errors property. The name produced an error. And so if we look at the errors produced, it is an object or an error object that says name is required and then blah, blah, blah. What I'm really trying to get at here is that it has this very nice, very well packaged up message property that we can get access to. So message right here, this is what we really care about at the end of the day, like 90% of the time. So we want to take this message and somehow show it to the user or log an error on our side, maybe just our server say, hey, there was an error when we tried to save this record or something like that. So what we really care about is the message property on here. What's tough is actually getting access to that property. So as we just saw, like this thing is deeply nested on this error object, okay, like deeply nested. And so I'm going to save us a little bit of a headache. We can get access to that message property by referring to validation result .errors.name.message. Okay, so this is basically the map that we can use to get to the error message. Also notice that I'm going to use a little bit of ES6 here to clean this up. So because the last property that I care about is named message, and my variable that I'm assigning it to is named message as well, I'm going to take off message at the end, and I'm going to wrap message over here with some curly braces. So this is 100% equivalent ES6 code. Okay, finally, and I know this is a long section, but this is the very last step, we can add in an assertion. So I'm going to assert that message is equal to our error message that we just saw of name is required. And again, this is being produced by our message that we recorded in our schema file. So we said name is required. So I will assert name is required. Let's save this. Check out our terminal, and yep, looks like specs are passing. Okay, so that's how we set up validation to require a specific property on a model. Let's continue in the next section and figure out how we add in some advanced rules around a validation or around a single property. So let's take a quick break. I'll see you in the next section.